robust statutory and moral intellectual property rights for audiovisual performers in the Canadian Copyright Act. My name is David Sparrow. I'm a working actor. For almost 30 years, I've been a member of the gig economy, a precarious worker, an artist. I have appeared in over 100 film and television roles and on stages across North America. That comparatively successful career does not necessarily make me a household name or financially stable. This is a tough business. I'm also the president of ACTRA, the Alliance of Canadian Cinema, Television and Radio Artists, where I help to represent 25,000 professional audiovisual English language performers across Canada who work to give voice to a wide diversity of Canadians to help define Canadian culture and to project our culture to the world. The average Canadian unionized performer earns less than $11,000 per year through work in film, TV, and other recorded media. They build their careers by working in a number of different media, earning small incomes from a number of different sources. Every one of those micro payments is important and helps to pay the bills between gigs. It is unfortunate that Canada has famous celebrities of years gone by who worked under terms that didn't include intellectual property protection, and today, in their senior years, they are living in poverty in subsidized housing. ACTRA has taken steps to negotiate use provisions into our contracts and ensure performers are paid for their work throughout its use. But the fact remains we need strong copyright provisions to underpin our rights as audiovisual performers. I am here today to make the case for the Copyright Act to be extended to audiovisual performers. Residuals and royalties, payments for the use and exploitation of our work here at home and around the world are the fair compensation all performers deserve. By example, through our negotiated contracts, I personally receive between $4,000 and $8,000 per year in royalties from the over 100 projects I spoke of earlier. Do the math. It's not a lot of money. We need a made-in-Canada copyright solution that will give performers the tools they and their unions and collection societies need to go after the remuneration they are owed. Strong copyright law guards against unauthorized use or misuse of an artist's work. There are international treaties that Canada can carefully implement to address these issues. But we can start by amending the Copyright Act to ensure Canadian audiovisual performers enjoy the same copyright protections that our audio performers already enjoy under the Act. ACTRA is certainly available and willing to help or consult further with the committee to arrive at strong language that will do no harm and will address these issues in the Canadian context. I will now pass you over to Laurie McAllister, ACTRA's Director of Performers' Rights Society and the Recording Artists Collection Society, PRS RACS, for more insights and detail. Laurie also serves on the board of SCAPRA, an international coordinating body of 60 performer collective management organizations from 43 countries working to improve the exchange of data and performer rights payments across borders. Laurie.
Thank you, David. The lack of economic and moral rights in Canada's Copyright Act means audiovisual performers don't receive the legislated protection that others in the creative class receive and is out of step with international standards. Audiovisual performers enjoy copyright protection in other countries around the world, including the exclusive right to authorize the use of their performances or an equitable remuneration right. ACTRA, through its established collective bargaining process, negotiates use rights with producers for audiovisual performances. We are seeking the codification of those rights to underpin our bargaining efforts and provide a framework for future negotiations. Establishing the right to receive royalties through contract or equitable remuneration is necessary to ensure that performers can earn a fair share of revenue generated from their exploitations. The need for a well-crafted statutory framework is critical, as digital distribution and consumption of content has dramatically risen, but the average income of performers has remained low. This value gap is evident in the fact that, despite the production boom in Canada, the average annual earnings per performer in 2017, as David said, was less than $11,000. The codification of these rights is also critical to establish reciprocity with countries whose audiovisual performers already enjoy copyright protection and economic rights. ACTRA PRS negotiates agreements with CMOs in foreign territories for the financial benefit of the recording artists that we represent through ACTRA RACS. By extending our existing audio performance rights to audiovisual, we could leverage our long-standing relationships with foreign CMOs to collect royalties for Canadian actors from foreign jurisdictions. As with economic rights, there is no good reason for audiovisual performers to be denied moral rights. A performer's resume, image, and reputation have a direct impact on their ability to earn a living. As such, we ask that audiovisual performers be granted moral rights in Canada, which includes the right to be identified as a performer in the performance, and the right to object to any material distortion or modification of the performance which would be prejudicial to their reputation. This would have no impact on the normal course of editing and exploitation, and is a right currently afforded to sound recording artists. For the sound recording artists that we represent through Actor Rax, we echo requests that have been expressed here by other witnesses. One is to repeal the $1.25 million exemption for commercial radio. Canada is the only country with such an exemption, and there is no reason that recording artists should continue to subsidize large, profitable media corporations that rely on the exploitation of an artist's work for profit. Two, amend the definition of sound recording in Section 2 of the Act. Currently, performers and makers aren't compensated when sound recordings are used in film and TV, resulting in an estimated $55 million in lost revenue annually. In 44 countries around the world, performers and makers receive royalties when sound recordings are used in film and TV, including France, Germany, and the UK. Three, the private copying levy, which was intended to be technologically neutral but has been limited to blank CDs. We all know copies of music are made on devices, such as smartphones, meaning rights holders have not been compensated for billions of private copies made of their work. The impact has been devastating, with private copy revenues dropping from $38 million in 2004 to less than $3 million in 2016. We support the Canadian Private Copying Collective's proposal, which includes a long-term solution for copyright reform and an interim proposal for a 4-year, $40 million per year fund to ensure rights holders are compensated for copies of their work until a more permanent solution can be enacted. While it's easier than ever to have your creative work seen and heard around the world, it's harder than ever to be properly compensated. Most actors and recording artists receive modest compensation for their time spent recording a work which is exploited for profit for decades, while artists continue to struggle. We've heard it many times. The middle-class artist is disappearing. It's critical that our legislation ensures performers are fairly compensated for the value they create. To that end, we ask the committee to consider the recommendations we have outlined here today, mindful of the rights and the need of performers to share in the economic benefit of the works they create.
I thank the committee for their time and work today and look forward to your questions.
Thank you. We will now go to Robert Malcolmson from BCE, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, honorable committee members. My name is Robert Malcolmson. I'm Senior Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at BCE. Thank you for your invitation to provide Bell's views on copyright reform that will help ensure artists and content creators are paid for the work they create. Bell is Canada's largest communications company, employing 51,000 Canadians and investing $4 billion in advanced networks and media content last year. We are also a key supporter of Canada's cultural and democratic system, investing approximately $900 million per year in Canadian content and operating the largest networks of both local TV and local radio stations in the country. As a content creator and major economic partner with Canada's creative community, we share an interest in protecting the economic model that supports our cultural industries. I look forward to sharing this perspective with you. In our presentation today, we will focus on the impact of organized content theft. This issue is fundamental to the topic the committee is studying, because no matter what remuneration model you adopt, creators can never be fairly compensated if their work is being widely stolen. There is an emerging consensus among creators, copyright owners, legitimate commercial users, and intermediaries that large-scale and often commercially motivated piracy operations are a growing problem in Canada. Piracy sites now regularly reach up to 15.3% of Canadian households through widely available and easy-to-use illegal set-top boxes. This is up from effectively 0 5 years ago. In addition, there were 2.5 billion visits to piracy sites to access stolen TV content last year, and 1 in every 3 Canadians obtained music illegally in 2016. Each of these measures has also grown significantly over time. According to recent research conducted for ISED and Heritage, 26% of Canadians self-report as accessing pirated content online. TV piracy in Canada has an estimated economic impact in the range of $500 to $650 million annually. In light of these concerning trends, we believe it is necessary to modernize the Copyright Act and related enforcement measures to meet the challenge posed by global internet piracy. To be clear, protecting creators in this way does not mean targeting individual Canadians who access copyright infringing material. Rather, it means addressing the operators of commercial-scale copyright infringing services. It is these large infringing operations that harm the cultural industries that employ more than 600,000 Canadians, account for approximately 3% of our GDP, and tell the uniquely Canadian stories that contribute to our shared cultural identity. With all of this in mind, we have 3 recommendations. First, modernize the existing criminal provisions in the Copyright Act. Criminal penalties for organized copyright crime are an effective deterrent that do not impact individual users or interfere with legitimate innovation. The Act already contains criminal provisions for content theft undertaken for commercial purposes, but they deal with illegal copying, while modern forms of content theft rely on streaming. These provisions should be made technologically neutral so that they apply equally to all forms of commercial-scale content theft. Second, increase public enforcement of copyright. In jurisdictions such as the UK and the United States, law enforcement and other public officials are actively involved in enforcement actions. We recommend that the government should create and consider enshrining in the Copyright Act an administrative enforcement office and should direct the RCMP to prioritize digital piracy investigations. Third and finally, directly empower either the CRTC or the courts to order intermediaries to contribute to remedying copyright infringements. All players in the ecosystem have a role to play in promoting compliance with the rules that support the appropriate remuneration of creators. Early this year, an unprecedented coalition of creators, broadcasters, and other industry players, called Fair Play Canada, filed an application with the CRTC seeking to require internet service providers to disable access to the most egregious piracy sites. Earlier this month, the CRTC recognized the harm being caused by piracy, but determined it did not have the statutory jurisdiction to grant the coalition's application. This committee could recommend that the Telecommunications Act be updated to provide that jurisdiction to the CRTC. In addition, a new provision could be added to the Copyright Act that would apply more broadly to intermediaries such as ISPs, web hosts, domain name registrars, search engines, payment processors, and advertising networks. In practice, this would mean adding a section to the Copyright Act that allows a court to issue an order directly to, for example, a web host to take down an egregious piracy site, a search engine to delist it, or a payment processor to stop collecting money for it, or a registrar to revoke its domain. While financial liability for these intermediaries is not appropriate, they can and should be expected to take these reasonable steps to contribute to protecting the integrity of copyright that is essential to all remuneration models for creators. Thank you for the opportunity to present our views, and we look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you. So now we will go to Rogers Communications with Pam Dinsmore and Christina Milbourne, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Pam Dinsmore, and I am Vice President Regulatory Cable at Rogers Communications, Inc. I am here with my colleague, Christina Milbourne, Director of Copyright and Broadband at Rogers. We appreciate the opportunity to share our views with you today. Rogers is a diversified Canadian communications and media company offering wireless, high-speed internet, cable television, radio, and television broadcasting. We support a Copyright Act that takes a balanced approach to the interests of rights holders, users, and intermediaries, thereby optimizing the growth of digital services and investments in innovation and content. As a member of both the CAB, Canadian Association of Broadcasters, and the Business Coalition for Balanced Copyright, we also support their comments in this review. While both the INDU Committee and the Heritage Committee are dealing with Copyright Act reform, we understand that this committee's focus is on increasing remuneration to artists, creators, and rights holders for the use of their creative works. Fair compensation for creators is key to ensuring the continued health of the Canadian media landscape, and we believe we are doing our part to ensure that creators are paid for their work. For example, in our capacity as a broadcaster, a BDU, and an ISP, Rogers contributes to the compensation of artists in the following ways. We spend $900 million annually on the production of Canadian programming, and each year we remit copyright royalties for the music, in specialty and TV Everywhere streaming services, as well as approximately $25 million annually in copyright payments to compensate creators whose programming is retransmitted in the distant signals we distribute. The importance of these contributions and royalty payments cannot be overstated. However, there is leakage in the system. As we stated before the Indu Committee, we have watched the rise of streaming stolen content on preloaded set-top boxes with deepening concern. In our view, the proliferation of unlawful IPTV streaming services and preloaded set-top boxes is inextricably linked with decreased remuneration for creators. For instance, it has been estimated that streaming piracy is resulting in approximately $500 million of lost subscriber revenue to the Canadian television industry. This means that for creators, on this $500 million of lost BDU revenue, zero copyright royalties are being paid to rights holders for programming in distant signals, zero contributions are being made to the Canada Media Fund, and zero programming contributions are being made for Canadian productions. The Canadians are increasingly, and often unwittingly, consuming stolen content online is borne out by recent studies. For example, Sandvine, a Canadian company that conducts network analytics, reported that in 2017, roughly 15% of Canadian households were streaming stolen content using preloaded set-top boxes. These boxes access an IP address that provides the stream. While illegal downloading remains a major problem for rights holders, illegal streaming has become the primary vehicle by which thieves make the stolen content available. We have taken action to address this growing problem using the existing remedies under the Copyright Act, but these remedies are insufficient. We therefore propose the following changes to the Act. First, the Act should make it a criminal violation for a commercial operation to profit from the theft and making available of rights holders' exclusive and copyrighted content on streaming services. In our experience, the existing civil prohibitions are not strong enough to deter this kind of content theft. Second, the Act should allow rights holders to apply to a court for injunctive relief against any intermediary which forms part of the online infrastructure distributing stolen content, including ISPs, domain name registrars, search engines, web hosting services, and content delivery networks. For example, a rights holder should be able to quickly obtain an order from a court to require an ISP to disable access to stolen content available on preloaded set-top boxes without concern that the operation of Section 36 of the Telecommunications Act might impede this effort. Currently, the existing judicial process available to rights holders is too time-consuming, too expensive, and too multifaceted to be effective in a world where stolen content can be shared around the world with the click of a mouse before a court has an opportunity to provide relief against copyright infringement. The Fair Play Coalition, of which Rogers is a part, explicitly requested that the CRTC create an agency for the expedient adjudication of online piracy disputes. In denying the Fair Play application, the Commission specifically pointed to the Copyright Act review as the right venue for considering this issue. In our view, it is now incumbent on this committee to seriously consider that request of rights holders in order to preserve the healthy operation of the Canadian broadcasting system. In addition to these proposed amendments addressing illegal streaming, we have two further suggestions that, if implemented, would benefit creators. First, amend Section 19.3 of the Copyright Act to create a more advantageous royalty split between artists and record labels. More specifically, change the 50-50 split to a 75-25 split, for example, in favor of artists. This was a suggestion made to the Indu Committee last month by noted copyright lawyer J. Kerr Wilson, who underscored that such an amendment, if implemented, would result in the immediate enrichment of creators without threatening the radio industry. Second, augment the resources of the Copyright Board to increase the expediency with which it releases its decisions. Last year, within the context of the Copyright Board consultation, the BCBC introduced a number of suggestions to improve the operation of the board. We would direct this committee to that document in order to ensure that Canada's rate-setting body continues to keep pace with the rapid progression of technology so that creators can receive remunerative payments within a reasonable amount of time. These are our brief comments. We would be pleased to answer any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Et puis maintenant, nous commençons
And now we will start the question and answer period, starting with Mr. Breton. Yes, good morning. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Don't know if you need your headset for the translation. Are you okay? Est-ce que la traduction fonctionne?
Is the interpretation working? Do you hear me? Test, test. This is the English channel. Is the interpretation working now? Okay, great. Thank you. My first question is for you, Mr. Sparrow, and Ms. McAllister. You say that there is a value gap between the value of what you create and what you are paid for in the Canadian and world music sector. Is there a similar value gap in the TV and film industry in Canada? And if so, what are the consequences of this value gap for the Canadian sector? Either of you can respond.
First and most important thing is that because we, as audiovisual performers, are not currently recognized under the Copyright Act, then we don't have the statutory and moral rights to be able to basically demand or negotiate the payments that are tied to the international and even national exploitation of our work. We do have strong contracts within ACTRA that allow for basically residual payments to be paid as our producer partners gain monies, but there are other monies around the world that we don't have access to, and so I would say that is certainly a gap that we're not seeing filled.
Alors, comment est-ce que les...
How do ACTRA members get fair remuneration for works that are protected by copyright?
Like I say, very strong contracts. In fact, this is our 75th year as a union representing performers, and we have long contracts that deal with residual payments and royalty payments. Usually, a producer who receives a licensing fee or monies, we get 3.6% of that distributor's gross revenue, split among all the performers in a project. However, like I say, there are other monies around the world. So, for instance, we got into an agreement through the Performers' Rights Society, which Laurie could speak to, with Spain. And I personally, when we signed that agreement with Spain, $928, which is not the biggest number in the world, but it's important to me, flowed to me from an account that it was sitting in Spain and was not going to come to me until we made that deal. If we simply start to give if the Copyright Act is changed to give us those statutory rights, then there are opportunities all around the world for those monies to flow to performers and benefit them.
Merci. Ma prochaine question.
Thank you. My next question is for you, Ms. Dinsmore. You spoke earlier about a 75% share. Is the interpretation working for you? Yes, you spoke earlier about a 75% per 25 split for a submission you submitted to the industry committee last week. Can you tell us a little bit more about this proposal? And also, what is the current situation on that?
Was broached, I believe, with you by the Canadian Association of Broadcasters at their appearance on the 24th of September. Susan Wheeler, who also is at Rogers, discussed this and suggested that this committee look at that split. It was raised by J. Kerr Wilson in front of the INDU committee, but essentially, under Section 19.3 of the Copyright Act, under the regime for radio and for commercial radio, ultimately the monies, the royalties that accrue from that tariff are split 50-50 between artists, performers on the one side and the labels on the other side. What we're suggesting is that calibration be revised to provide more money to the artists, less money to the labels. As we know, the labels are primarily multinationals. They're large companies. There are many of them based in the U.S. There are not that many that are Canadian. I think 2% of the monies go to Canadian labels. On the artist side, about 28%, I think, right now, of the monies go to Canadian artists. We think that if the pool was bigger, then obviously the 28% pot would be greater, and more money could very quickly and easily be funneled towards Canadian artists.
Ma dernière question.
My last question is for Mr. Malcolmson. Thank you for your recommendations. They were appreciated. Are you aware of various models elsewhere in the world for copyright, and what could be applied here in Canada?
Are numerous examples in other countries of regimes that allow for intermediaries to block access to pirated content. And so I think in the Fair Play application, we cited 47 other countries that have those regimes in place to help protect the remuneration of artists by blocking access to piracy. So in our proposals, both in front of the CRTC and here today, we're saying, take those models that have proven successful in other jurisdictions and apply them here. I think some of the data that we filed with the Fair Play application showed that where there are blocking regimes for egregious pirate content, you stem the flow of piracy in the range of 90%. So they're very effective, they're expedient, and they can be done at very low cost relative to protracted judicial proceedings.
Thank you very much.
Maintenant, nous allons.
And now we will move to Mr. Blaney. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for joining us this morning. First of all, I would like to say I see that there was some overlap between the presentations by Rogers and Bell concerning streaming.
En français. Moi, j'essaie de trouver le mot.
I'm trying to find the right word in French for streaming. 15% of the market is escaping you because of illegal sites, and I think that the message is clear. But if I come back to the presentation.
From our friend from ACTRA, you've mentioned, if my understanding is well, that those who are involved, actors, are not covered by the Copyright Act. Is that correct?
Yes, it's my understanding at this time that audiovisual performers are not protected under the Copyright Act, but audio performers are, musicians.
Audio, yeah, and not visual. Is it the case in other countries? You've mentioned some recommendation. You went through them, so you would recommend that those visual actors would be included in the Copyright Act. Is it the same in other countries? Is it the case?
Yes, there are lots of countries around the world that I think we could look to as an example where audiovisual performers receive economic benefit for their work. I mean, we could look at France, Germany, the Netherlands.
Okay. Since you have those strong contracts,
Yeah.
what would it add to your protection or benefit if this was included in the Copyright Act?
I think what we're looking for is certainty in the Copyright Act. Certainty that we can continue to negotiate for these rights, that, as I've heard it described before, having it codified in the Act provides sort of a contractable space, right? Where it's recognized that these rights have value and these rights are to be bargained for or negotiated.
Okay. So my question now is, like I would probably say, the elephant in the room. What about those revenue? We mentioned the illegal streaming, which is a loss of revenue, but now there are new ways for a consumer to access to visual product. Yesterday I knocked at my superintendent and he was watching Netflix. So what are your thoughts on from an actor's perspective of the revenue you are picking from these, well, it's a new form of sharing and diffusing content?
So that's a very important point, and I think that as we look at being an actor in this country, around the world, it's becoming tougher and tougher to make a living. Each one of these words I'm about to say is an hour-long conversation, but they each mean something to performers. New technology, fragmentation, consolidation, streaming services, and certainly the actual cost of living if you're trying to live in Toronto or Vancouver. It makes even more important the establishing these rights within the Copyright Act so that as technologies change, as delivery systems change, we can see that long tail, and those micropayments will add up to paying the bills in between the jobs that we're fortunate to land.
So from a government's point of perspective, the Copyright Act is a way to address this issue?
I think it underpins each of those conversations. There'll be other work to do. The devil's always in the details. There's various international agreements that we could become part of and ensure that we have a Canadian context for those and that they do no harm as we enter into them. But absolutely giving and recognizing the rights of audiovisual performers is the right direction to go in.
Thank you. Madame Dunsmore, I was interested to find you were willing to share more with artists than you actually do. Is that correct? You say you want to split a right to go from 50-50 to 75-25, so this would mean more revenue for the artists?
This would mean more revenue for the artists, but it's not a bucket that Rogers controls. It's
Okay, it's true.
It's a
It's
royalty.
from the record labels. Okay, so it's
Exactly.
so you're not involved in this.
No.
Okay.
No, well, no, not directly.
Okay. Thank you. Oui, I may share my time with my colleague here.
Okay, Mr. Shields?
Well,
You
thank
have
you.
about 2 minutes.
Let me just follow up on that one in a sense. Can you tell me how the revenue from Bell, Rogers, and we'll start with you, is shared with the actors?
How the revenue from Rogers is shared with the actors?
Do you pay the actors? How do
Well, I mean, I can go back over how we contribute to the system and how ultimately that money trickles down to the actors.
So it's nice of you to suggest that the record labels should give up some of theirs. Are you willing to give up some of your revenue to them?
I can tell you that as a licensed Canadian broadcaster, we have obligations for Canadian programming expenditures.
No. Are you willing to give up some more money, as you suggested the record label should?
I don't know what the mechanism would be for that.
Well, then why are you suggesting somebody else should give up their money? It's a little strange that you're
something-
suggesting somebody else give up money, but not your company.
Yeah,
I find it strange. Let's go over here with piracy in the sense of you brought that up. We had the border guy representing border stations from the U.S. Do you know who his complaint was with? The CRTC for legitimizing stealing of American signals on Canadian cable networks.
So,
And you want the CRTC to enforce it? He wants the CRTC not to enforce piracy in Canada.
well, what he described was the retransmission regime whereby U.S. border stations are authorized under the current Copyright Act to be retransmitted by cable and satellite providers like Rogers and Bell. So
But no money to the people who produce it.
no, there are copyright royalties payable every time a signal is retransmitted. So there is a payment in the form of copyright royalties, and there is a legal right to retransmit those signals. I think our perspective as the largest operator of Canadian over-the-air television stations is that if we're focused on supporting Canadian culture, supporting Canadian artists, there's certainly a case to be made for the Canadian over-the-air stations to be remunerated when they're retransmitted in Canada. But in terms of the U.S. border stations, they don't make anywhere near the same, they don't make any contribution to Canadian culture. So we don't see the public policy merits of them being compensated for being retransmitted here. But certainly we see public policy merits that would benefit actors, creators, producers of Canadian local TV stations being remunerated when they're retransmitted.
Thank you.
Maintenant, nous continuons avec
And now we're continuing with Mr. Nantel. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us. There's a lot of experience around the table, and I think that the mandate of this committee, and you said, Ms. Dinsmore, I appreciate your comment that our mandate is to ensure that creators in Canada are protected. It's a strange tango between two committees. There are two reports, and it's at the government's discretion. And I think it's unfortunate that there's this give and take, that there's a vacuum. We don't know what the other committee is working on, and we're kind of choosing things randomly. But I'd like to ask ACTRA a question first. I would like to say I would like you to tell us how important it would be for Canada to not be a laggard in protecting copyright. We are currently not a leader. We are not a leader in comparison with international standards, and it creates a problem for rights holders. Because you said that there are sums that you can seek overseas because you have rights there that you don't have here. And for foreign rights holders, it's not lucrative to invest in Canada because they're not as well protected here as they are elsewhere. Is that right?
To me that there are monies collected by foreign countries that would flow to Canadians, but they won't do it until our own country recognizes us in the Copyright Act. And that's, frankly, they owe the money. They should make it flow. But perhaps Laurie can speak to your question more
Sure.
specifically.
Reciprocity forms the basis of those international exchanges. So because we are lacking that in our Copyright Act, we're not able to access the money that is collected in foreign territories, for audiovisual productions, Canadian audiovisual productions featuring Canadian performers that are shown overseas. So I think that for our membership, really, that is probably one of the key things that we're looking to resolve with this review.
Thank you. Madame Dinsmore, vous avez...
Ms. Dinsmore, you saw the very Cartesian nature of my colleague, Mr. Shields, who's asking you how you can ask other people to give profits when you're not giving up any yourself. I really respect your professionalism in that question, but I think that by times there is a difference in testimony because we're in a period where there's less money in the system, and what the predecessor of Mr. Rodriguez called an ecosystem, and it's true, we always work together well, but things haven't been going so well for 10 years, but for 50 years, there was content created, and then you broadcasted it, and money came back to creators, and things worked quite well. And now, well, you mentioned that it's true that editors are taking too much, and there are people who are saying, well, radio stations are given a $1.2 million break, and there's some fighting. There's some infighting because
we see each other.
Yep.
So we're having a family discussion here, and we're blaming everyone. Because, we shouldn't do that. I did that for you 20 years ago. Why do I still do that? Well, you keep all the money, and the creators are dying. All of that is nice. It's a family supper, and we can discuss. But the reality is that the money is leaving the country. The reality is that we are not in charge, not in control anymore. And it is good business for telecoms. Not for the media side. I understand when you say that you buy productions. You're talking about me. Bell Media is actually probably losing money. And I'm sorry for Sandy Rinaldo. I'm sorry for everyone in the news business. But you guys, you wire guys, you internet, mobile appliances suppliers, you are contributing to the invasion. You are the passers of all this new system coming up. So when I see here that in both your presentations, and I can appreciate the fact that first it's translated because the one that's been submitted to the CRTC was all in English, I remember. It was 11 pages on such a broad topic. That was not very generous from BCE. And now you say Bell souhaite contribuer à la protection du modèle économique qui soutient nos industries.
Bell would like to support economic prosperity.
Le Conseil de la radiodiffusion et des télécommunications.
The CRTC established the distribution fund to facilitate the broadcasting of Canadian high-quality content that was underrepresented during heavy listening periods. The spirit of creation of this fund and the quotas, was it not to ensure in this is a perfect example of money that is taken into the good business of cable companies to manage Canadian content on our screens. Are we abandoning that principle today? Because I think that you're abandoning it.
I'll try to break down what I think your question is. You're right that we today find ourselves in a regulated ecosystem which is much different than the unregulated ecosystem which we compete with. So I guess the perspective we look at it from is not necessarily to look to the ISPs to contribute to culture per se, but perhaps look to that parallel ecosystem, you know, the Netflixes of the world, the Amazon channels, all of the over-the-top non-Canadian services that are coming here and filling a market need and serving Canadians and also taking revenue out of Canada while making no contribution to Canadian culture. So if
But it means good business for broadband for you. People need a lot of broadband.
certainly any traffic that travels on the broadband pipe is good for business, but the other perspective is all of that traffic on the broadband pipe requires continuous investment in building out that network in order to be able to serve the appetites of
I'm sure
viewers and
a
users.
gas
So-
station is an
so-
investment.
We'll now be going to MP Andrew Dillon, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My first two questions will be for ACTRA. We've had other artists come and testify before the committee that recorded music isn't considered a sound recording when it's included in a soundtrack. Can you please comment on this?
Yes, sorry. So that was one of our two asks, and we echo those musicians who have come and asked that the definition of sound recording in Section 2 of the Copyright Act be amended so that sound recordings, when included in a soundtrack in an audiovisual work, be considered a sound recording, and that the performers and the makers be remunerated for that. So and I don't think I spoke to this, but the authors and publishers do receive remuneration for that, but the performers and makers are excluded currently.
Perfect. And recently, in light of our new NAFTA, or it's called USMCA now, the Canadian cultural rights were advocated for and protected under the New Deal. Can you please tell us how this deal has positively affected your industry?
I think the broad cultural exemption is a wonderful thing. It, as Canadians, we punch way above our weight in our productions, like Murdoch Mysteries and Frankie Drake Mysteries, and other great productions are seen in hundreds of countries around the world, and it projects Canada's culture to the world. And the fact that a sovereign nation is allowed to invest in its own culture and in the voices of its own people is great that it was protected, and it will continue to hopefully protect the processes we have in place in terms of the CMF and other funding bodies to be able to invest in Canadian culture and to bring Canadian works to our screens and to all around the world.
Perfect. And would like the other witnesses like to speak to this?
We were very involved with that part of the negotiations. We were kept up to speed on a regular basis with what was going on. And we too are very pleased that the cultural exemption has been maintained. It's very important for our industry. It's very important for our businesses. It's very important for Canadians to see themselves reflected on their screens. So yes, we are very supportive of the cultural exemption and the fact that it was protected.
Perfect. Would you like to add something?
I would just comments that have been made.
Perfect. So my following two questions will be for Rogers and BCE. I'd like to talk about ISP copyright liability. What do you think you can do to protect more copyrighted material? And if you could speak about the notice and notice regime at the same time, please.
Yeah, I'm happy to address the notice regime. It's important to understand that that only relates to downloads. It's not a useful mechanism for streaming, which is what we've come before you today with, looking for some other solutions. But sure, notice has been around for many, many years. It got codified 5 years ago in the Act. And ISPs are exempt from liability for the content that travels on their pipes but in exchange, they must participate in the notice and notice regime, and if we, for some reason, don't, then we can be sued for damages, but there is no copyright liability consequence of not being part of the notice and notice regime. So we actually send on about 2,400,000 notices a year, and it's an automatic process. And if we can't deliver a notice, we have to loop back to the rights holder and let them know that we couldn't deliver the notice. We've spoken to the INDU committee about the fact that we would like to have formalized notices baked right into the Act such that they would all look the same, they would be standardized, so there would be less incidents of notices not actually making it to the final destination. But we're very much supportive of that regime. But again, let me just stress, it only is useful with respect to illegal downloading, not with illegal streaming.
And once these notices are emitted, is there a change in the behavior of the people you've sent them to, or nothing changes?
It's interesting you asked that question. I had to address this 5 years ago, and in fact, it turned out that there were impacts as the same household, because it's not necessarily the same user, but as the same household receives 1, 2, 3, 4, there was a corresponding impact on effectively recidivism. So it was deemed at that stage to be useful enough that this Parliament decided to codify it in the last iteration of the Act, and that's the iteration that we see today.
Okay, perfect. And for BCE, would you like to add to?
I would just add that I think, to your last point, while the notice and notice regime is an imperfect remedy in the sense that it doesn't address streaming, it addresses downloads, as Pam said, it does, I think, play an important role in educating consumers who receive those notices that, you know, they may be unwittingly consuming copyright infringing content. So the provision of those notices to people that are using copyright infringing material is a good educational tool. At the same time, as we said in our presentation, the content piracy nevertheless continues to grow at a very disturbing rate, and it's undermining the entire ecosystem.
And you work with other countries who also see copyright infringement? Do they send you notice, or across this whole industry, or it's just more you're Canadian focused?
Well, we get requests to send notices to infringers from content owners both inside and outside of Canada, if that's your question.
And do you have to comply with them, or are there penalties for you if you don't?
If we didn't comply with the notice and notice regime, yes, we'd be subject to penalties. But we comply, like Rogers. We send out millions of notices every year, and so we comply with the regime.
Brings you to the end of your questions, but we will be going to MP David Yordiga, please. Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's right.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank the witnesses for coming today and talking business. And this is what it's all about, business. Just looking back when I was growing up, we didn't have a lot of choice. We were limited to what's available at the stores and on radio and TV. But that's changed. And I don't think industry has caught up yet to the reality that we can get programming from all around the world. And I think it's more of a competition issue. I mean, we have more choices. We have the ability to choose what we want to see, when we want to see it. So there's the time element and everything else. So things are changing rapidly. So my question to Mr. Sparrow is competition the real factor why artists are making less, because there's so much other material out there? So do you have an opinion on that? Can you your point of view on that aspect?
Well, it's interesting that right now in the world, there are apparently 500 English language TV series being recorded. None of us has the time to watch all of that programming. So there's a lot of work for performers. The question simply, as I'm repeating today, is how will the long use of that work be protected? And will you simply be paid for the day's work, or will you actually be paid for the ongoing use? And you mentioned what we grew up with. We're probably similar ages, we had 3 stations to choose from. You may remember Gilligan's Island. Gilligan's Island, Bob Denver worked at a time when there was no contracted residuals or royalties. And that's why we grew up on that program, because it could play all through the 70s with no payments to the actors whatsoever. And Bob Denver actually ended up retiring in less than splendid conditions because, although he was world famous, there was no monies for him. We've been able, through ACTRA, to negotiate with our producer partners to have some of those residuals and royalties. But at the same time, as I mentioned, some of our productions, many of our productions in Canada are now seen in hundreds of countries around the world. And the question is simply, are we receiving competition statutory rights through that? So yes, competition's increased, but somebody said just a little while ago that they felt there was less money in the system. Actually, because of all the streaming services, competition, the need for content is, in many ways, there's more money in the system, but it's not trickling down to our performers.
Well, thank you. And, just a little side comment here. At the end of the day, the consumer decides what they want to watch. And unfortunately, there's the piracy end of things. And it's a real big challenge. And I assume that dollar value is significant. That's being bled through the networks. And, the networks are doing fine because, myself, I consume a lot of data, and my children and everything else. So, we pay our data fee, which is sometimes I think is high, but I'm willing to pay it because I want to watch what I want to watch. So, but there's some challenges there too with infrastructure. So I understand there's a lot of investment on the telecommunications side, and a lot of times the urban centers subsidizes the rural area because we don't have enough customer base. So I understand the business side of that. But how can we deal with the piracy? They're ahead in the technological side. You put up roadblocks, they'll get around it. So are we going to win the war against piracy, or are we going to have to learn how to live with it? Can I get a comment from the networks?
Sure, I'll start. I think certainly we can win the war against piracy if we're provided with the right tools to win that war. And as I said earlier, there are over 40 countries around the world that have recognized, are confronting the same piracy problem we're confronting. And the solution that they have adopted, and which has had a sort of 75 to 90% success rate, is having internet service providers block access to that pirated content. So it's no longer available to the consumer that wants to consume pirated content, and it can be done expeditiously, efficiently, and at much lower cost than having to go to court every time you find a pirate site. If you look at the proliferation of pirate sites available on the internet under the current legal regime, a producer or a creator or a broadcaster would have to go to court each and every time it wanted to get an order from a court to block one single source of piracy. Complicating that is most of the pirate sites are located offshore. They operate online. They operate anonymously, so hard to find the defendant, hard to enforce when you finally get an order, and they pop up somewhere else. So it becomes an endless game of sort of whack-a-mole trying to stem the tide of piracy. So the answer, we think, is having internet service providers like Bell and like Rogers block those sites as they come in.
So, and on that whack-a-mole note, we will be moving over to MP Randy Boissonnault for the final 5 minutes.
I got a big stick. Okay, I want to go to ACTRA for like a minute, and then maybe we'll split the time. You have Bell and Rogers here. What can they do to increase the share of the pie to get more money to artists and actors?
Well, I think that first off, and I'm not sure it's the mandate of this committee, but I'll just say it, is ISP providers paying into the CMF and other funding models in order to support Canadian content would be huge in terms of creating more content and hiring more performers. And we count them, I will say, as great partners in our industry, and we've had long-term contracts with them. And basically, recognizing that when they talk about their Canadian content investments, it's all of their content investments from news magazines to sports to other, and they are doing some great programming right now as well, but more drama and Canadian storytelling is always welcome.
Thank you. It's a technical question, but the issue of neighboring rights to individuals and entities, would you advocate for a similar set of neighboring rights for those who make cinematographic recordings, so for the film and television industry as well, so that that can be captured and those artists can get fair compensation for their work as well?
Do you want to address that?
Well, I think that we currently have very strong collective bargaining rights, and we negotiate for those rights. If you're talking about a regime where we maintain those rights, but also enjoy a form of neighboring rights, I think that that is something that we would be very willing to discuss and explore.
It's been brought up by other proponents, so I've got 3 minutes left, so I'm going to keep moving on. To both BCE and Rogers, I appreciate that you're here, and your weight in the ecosystem is significant. So we have to state that. Your submissions to this committee ring hollow and tin ear. They're technical, they're overweighted to Indu, should have been a different submission. This is the place where we're advocating for artists. You said so in your submissions, and yet what we see is go after the ISPs, shut down the piracy. We get that, we know that. What are you going to do to make the piece of pie that goes to artists bigger? Because even if we get the $500 million back, it's the same size of the pie. There's nothing more that's coming from your shareholders to go into the pockets of artists. So where's the creativity from industry to put more money in the pockets of artists? Because you won't have things to sell from Canada if we don't support the artists. And consumers don't see that coming. It's like climate change. One day there's 6 tornadoes in this city and it's 22 centimeters of snow in September in Edmonton. It's too late. So what are you going to do before we get to that kind of 1.5 degrees and the planet is overheating in the ecosystem of content and getting more money to artists? You have a minute and a half. A minute each, Pam, and then Robert.
Sorry. Fair point, except that I think that you can't discount the $500 million that's leaking out of the system.
Same size of the pie.
But it's on that money that the monies are not being then allocated to support systems like the CMF, CPE, copyright payments. That's the problem. The problem is the leakage. And we don't think that there needs to be more mechanisms like an ISP tax. If you need higher royalties, go to the Copyright Board and get those royalties revised. Having an ISP tax is not the answer. That is going to simply raise the cost of internet to Canadians, which is of deep concern already to a number of people in this government and otherwise. So I think that really we want to make it clear that leakage is the problem. The $500 million is significant, and that's why our priority is to try and stem the flow of streaming piracy.
Okay.
And putting mechanisms in place to do that.
So you suggested that the recording industry cut what they're getting from artists in half so artists can get more, go from 50 to 25 so the artists can get 75%. Would you look at carving out some of what you get from the Canada Music Fund to put in a transitional fund for artists so they could get more money? Because you and BCE get the lion's share of Canada Music Fund payments. And so if we're going to get rid of the 1.5 million royalty regime, that's one part of it. But you could actually take less money from the government of Canada and put that in a fund for artists. Are you prepared to go there?
Well, we don't want to impact the local commitments that we have on our radio stations. And unfortunately, it all comes out of the same pie.
Okay,
so
thank
any
you, Robert.
monies, okay.
45 seconds. Thanks, Madam Chair.
So I'll be quick, but to address your first question, today BC contributes, I think it's $900 million a year. So 30% of our media business's revenues are reinvested in Canadian programming, which ultimately the artists and actors share in. 5% of our broadcasting distribution revenues are plowed back into the creation of Canadian content. And so what we're saying to you is that system was working, but the leakage from piracy is constantly reducing the amount of money that is going into that system that funds culture. And we need to solve that first. We need to stop that from happening. so that we can continuously contribute to culture.
And I want to thank all of the witnesses. If there are other comments that you want to make, you can also put in briefs with additional comments if there were things that you feel you need to bring out in response to some of the questions that were asked. But I'd like to thank all of you. We are going to suspend briefly while we change panels, and I'm just going to ask the members to please try and do this quickly because we have another full panel coming up. Thank you. back for our second hour. We have with us in person from SiriusXM, Oliver Jacola. And we have by video conference Spotify with Darren Schmidt. If you can just wave, we can see you. You can hear me? Yep, perfect. And we have Jennifer Mitchell from Casablanca Media Publishing. Thank you. So why don't we start with the video conferences just to make sure in case we run into technical issues. If we can start with Spotify. Darren Schmidt, you can start your presentation, please.
Thank you, Ms. Chair. I'm getting something of an echo, excuse me. Thank you for inviting Spotify to contribute to this committee's study. My name is Darren Schmidt. I am Senior Counsel at Spotify, responsible for content licensing in Canada and globally, and I've been working on music industry issues for 17 years. Before joining Spotify, I worked at a major music company, often touching on issues related to Canada. I'm delighted today to be able to talk to you about Spotify, particularly the benefits of our service to recording artists and songwriters as well as their fans, and also as we've been requested to do by this committee, to explain generally the various ways we pay royalties to rights holders, recording artists, and musicians. First, let me introduce the company. Spotify is a Swedish company created in Stockholm in 2006. Our service launched for the first time in 2008 and was made available in Canada in 2014. Our mission was and remains to unlock the potential of human creativity by giving 1 million creative artists the opportunity to live off their art and billions of fans the opportunity to enjoy and be inspired by these creators. Spotify is now available in 65 markets, and we have more than 180 million active users on our service every month, and 83 million paying subscribers. Through August 2018, we paid over 10 billion euro back to rights holders around the world. And Spotify is heavily invested in the Canadian music industry and supports the creators of music, whether they be songwriters, composers, recording artists, or performers. Spotify has given Canadian artists great exposure via our playlists. Some of Canada's most popular weekly playlists on Spotify are Hot Hits Canada with 500,000 followers, New Music Friday Canada with 250,000 followers. In fact, Prime Minister Trudeau even released a playlist on Spotify himself. More than 10,000 unique Canadian artists have been promoted through Spotify editorial and algorithmic programming in the past month alone. In 2017, we partnered with the Canadian government to celebrate Canada's 150th birthday. Influential Canadians created and shared their own Spotify playlists of top Canadian artists and tracks, and this fall we're planning to launch a campaign specifically targeted at growing our Francophone hip-hop art audience. Artists' revenues are rising because the music industry as a whole is growing again after a terrible run in the early 2000s. Canada, like many markets, entered a steep decline in revenues as piracy sites like Napster took off. Broadly speaking, recorded music revenues nearly halved since their peak in the late 90s, and Canada was no different. But things have changed for the much better. Not only is the global music industry back to growth, but so is music in Canada. 2017 was the first year that revenue from music streaming services like Spotify accounted for over half of the overall music market. This is a remarkable achievement given that revenue from this segment was negligible just 5 years ago, and Spotify has been a big part of that comeback story. With that introduction out of the way, as we've been asked to do, I want to turn now to providing some detail for this committee about how Spotify licenses its music and how those licenses result in payments to rights holders and creators. By its nature, Spotify's service is one that relies on licenses from rights holders in order to get content on our service. As I believe the committee is aware, music has two separate copyrights associated with it, one for the song or musical compositions and a separate one, copyright for the sound recording itself. The copyrights to the songs are typically held by music publishers. We'll be hearing from one today. And while the sound recordings are typically owned by record labels. And to make things more confusing, the music publishers and record labels, particularly the larger ones, are often owned by the same overall holding companies and sometimes share ultimate management. Spotify obtains licenses from both sides of this divide. For the sound recordings, we obtain global rights from the three major record companies, that's Universal, Sony, and Warner, as well as Merlin, which represents the rights of many independent record labels. Spotify also has direct licenses with hundreds of smaller and medium-sized record labels around the world, as well as some recording artists directly to the extent they control the right to their own music. On the music publishing side, that is for the songs underlying those sound recordings, the world is much more fragmented. This fragmentation has two primary causes. First, unlike the world of sound recordings, it's relatively common for a musical composition to be owned by several different entities. Consider the track In My Feelings by Canadian artist Drake. The copyright for that sound recording is controlled by a single record label. But the musical composition underlying that track has 16 different credited songwriters, along with 5 different music publishers, each controlling a different percentage of those rights. So here we have an example of per-work ownership fragmentation. Second, depending on the territory, different kinds of entities or royalty collection societies will control different kinds of composition rights. Canada is an excellent example. In Canada, Spotify has a license with SOCAN, but that license is limited to the public performance rights of the compositions played on our service in Canada. But the reproduction right, sometimes called the mechanical right, for those same compositions, for which Spotify also obtains a license, comes from other entities, primarily CSI, along with others. So Spotify pays SOCAN, CSI, and others, and those entities in turn are responsible for distributing those royalties to their rights holders, songwriters, and music publishers. I should note here that I'm leaving a lot out, primarily about how in Canada, unlike in some other territories, there is no blanket mechanical license, which would be very helpful in ensuring that all songwriters are appropriately paid. And there are a lot of changes forthcoming in the market as well. For example, SODRAC, which controls primarily Francophone mechanical rights, was recently purchased by SOCAN, which until recently focused only on performance rights, all of which may substantially change the licensing landscape in the near future. In summary, Spotify was a late entrant into Canada due to our determination to respect copyright and seek licenses rather than rely on copyright safe harbors. Since launching in 2014, our story and that of Canadian music has been one of success. Today, millions of Canadians are choosing not to